I just want to start with, I'll be on camera for right now, and then because of a bandwidth issue, I'm going to go off camera, let you focus on the slides, and then I'll come back on camera for some Q&A at the end. And I apologize in advance, we were going to have a panel discussion, but I'm doing it solo today and looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to some good questions at the end so we can all have a chance to participate. So anyway, as Kristen mentioned, my name is Mark Debus, and I'm the Behavioral Health Team Lead at Sedgwick. My team works with injured workers who filed a workers' compensation claim, and we help them with addressing personal issues that get in the way of their physical and emotional recovery after a workplace accident. I'm also a master's level licensed clinical social worker, so therapist, and I've worked in the mental health field for over 30 years. And in that time, I've talked with thousands of individuals struggling with psychosocial issues and mental illness. And for the last 6 years, I've been working in the workers' comp realm. This is our agenda today, and we're going to learn a lot about empathy. Now, I'm going to step away a little bit and take off my workers' comp hat and put on my clinician hat for a lot of what we're discussing today, partly because that might be some new information for you. I also find it really interesting, to be honest with you. But I will bring it into the workers' comp realm during it, and a lot of this will apply to what we do on a day-to-day basis in our work. So as far as an overview, I'm going to cover some overview. We're going to discuss some brief history of empathy and development of empathy. We're going to look at why it's important in the claims handling realm. I'm going to ask and give you some opportunity to envision what empathy might look like and what it doesn't look like to get a better idea of how that might apply in your day-to-day work. And we're going to really focus on barriers to empathy, especially during this time of COVID-19. There's a lot of barriers to empathy, and also with the election coming up. And that's really the only political thing I'm going to say today, I promise. But there's just a lot of stressors now in the environment, and that's all going to impact us and create barriers to empathy. And then we're going to do a brief discussion on active listening, which is at the cornerstone of conveying empathy. My favorite topic is acting with empathy and what that might look like. And then we're going to conclude with some questions and discussions. So if you have questions during this, feel free to type them in and we'll gather them. There will be opportunity at the end for discussions and questions. So before we get part of the overview, I want to cover two main things that a lot of people may have some misunderstandings about. When we talk about empathy, we're really talking about two different types of empathy. Empathy can be broken down into either affective empathy or cognitive empathy. Now, when we're talking about affective empathy, and I'll go into that in just a bit, it's more related to emotional connection with people. And the cognitive empathy is related to having an understanding of what an experience is or a point of view. And then there's also the concern of empathy versus compassion. And a lot of people use those interchangeably, and I want to go over just a bit some of the differences between those two. To give you a little bit more information about affective empathy. And what that really means is it occurs when you can emotionally feel what another person is feeling. Most of us have some degree of this sensitivity, but it's definitely more pronounced in some people versus others. Now, there is cognitive empathy, which is the understanding of someone else's experience and being able to put yourself in their shoes. So as I mentioned before, there's a difference between affective and cognitive empathy. Now, just on a side note, you've probably heard the term empath before, probably on social media. There's memes going around, oh, I'm a super empath, and people take a lot of pride in that. You've probably seen it in maybe even superhero movies or sci-fi television shows like Star Trek: The Next Generation. Deanna Troi was an empath. What they're really referring to are people with strong affective empathy abilities. For the purposes of what we're talking about, we're going to talk about both affective and cognitive empathy, and I'm going to kind of lump them together as far as empathy goes. There is a difference in the developmental piece of it between the two. That's something that I think by the time you're an adult, you should have at least a cursory knowledge or hopefully a mastery of both types of empathy. So, all right. So let's get to empathy versus compassion. Empathy is a term that is used a lot in modern business, and many folks use the term empathy and compassion interchangeably. Although, in my opinion, they're both really important, they are not the same thing. Empathy, again, with affective and cognitive components, is experiencing or understanding someone else's experiences and emotions. Now, compassion takes it a step further, and this refers to the drive that we may experience to help other people. And so, if we have empathy, hopefully we'll be driven to act with compassion as well. And that would then drive our actions to assist somebody further. Now, here's an example of what I mean. If you're working with an injured worker and you heard the phrase, "I hear that you're upset," that's an empathic response. How would that feel to you? I imagine it feels pretty good. Someone is getting what you're experiencing. Maybe they're understanding what you're going through or how you're feeling. So it's good to have that type of validation. You may feel a little bit more close to them. Maybe they're starting to develop rapport with you. Maybe they're starting to get what you're going through. The second example, I can see that this is upsetting, and I'm sorry for that. It must be awful to feel that your life has been upended through no fault of your own. I'd really like to help you get this resolved as quickly as possible so you can get on with your life and hopefully put this awful chapter behind you. I've actually said something like that to people, and that's more of a compassionate response because it refers to things I'm going to do to help them or my goal to help them. Now, if you're an injured worker and you hear the compassionate response from your claims examiner, what must that be like for you? Probably feels pretty good. Okay, so people's ability to show empathy is actually on a continuum. Some are really good at it, and many need a lot more work in that area. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, pretty good at it, but sometimes needing some improvements when we're overwhelmed or stressed. And I'll get into some barriers to empathy in a bit. But I want to think of, I want us all to be mindful of times in our personal life or work. There are friends who almost seem to have a psychic connection to our mood. And then there's that one coworker who just doesn't seem to get that you're stressed by something that he's doing. I'm not talking about people with mental illness or personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder, which is commonly called psychopaths or sociopaths. And I'm also not talking about people who might be neurotypical, like those who may be on the autism spectrum. What I'm talking about is most everyday people are born with a propensity to have some level of empathy. That's the innate part. And like most things human, there does also seem to be not only a genetic component to what that base level is, but there's also a learned component to it. And the good news is that even if you inherited a bad combination of empathy genes, believe it or not, there are actual empathy genes. Your genetics are only a starting point. You can learn empathy. And most of the time, empathy is learned early on, usually before the age of 4, sometimes 5. But it is a skill that you can learn to improve upon even in your adulthood. So if you've got a colleague that doesn't seem to exhibit that too much, you can work with them and help them exhibit that more. You can also work on improving your own empathy skills if people are commenting to you that you seem cold or unfeeling. If those are comments that people have said to you, that's usually an indication that maybe you could work on empathy skills. And that is, unfortunately, something that you can do even in your adulthood. So that brings me to the developmental theory of empathy. And I'm not going to do the whole empathy 101 with you right now, although it's a fascinating topic, I assure you. But there is some basic developmental things that you should be aware of. Usually, we see evidence of empathy in children as early as 18 months. Now, remember what I said before about affective and cognitive empathies. By age 2, most kids are capable of displaying affective empathy. You can see this by a child picking up on social cues, a child um, displaying mood consistencies with their parent. You can see this by a child becoming upset when other people are upset around them. And you also start to see a child engage in imaginative play or pretend play. That's usually an indication that empathy is happening. Now, by age 4, you'll begin to see cognitive empathy develop. Now, kids around that age start to grasp basic concepts of other people's experiences might not be the same as their own. People start noticing differences in others and commenting on those differences. And if you're ever in a playground with a 4-year-old, you'll know what this looks like, or a 3-year-old. Like, why is that man different, or what's wrong with her legs, or you see those types of comments. But it's a way of the child then understanding that people are different. And also along with that children start to begin to understand that people have different motivations and different experiences than themselves that aren't always necessarily viewable by someone's emotional state. So that's where cognitive empathy develops, and it's usually by age 4. Now, that particular component, the cognitive empathy piece of it, that is something that you can learn more easily than the affective empathy, especially as an adult, if you haven't had good development as a child in that area. And so on the screen right now, it should have a big word, empathy. And it says, is not easy for most people, or many people. And there is a trend in recent years to express less empathy than before. Now, this research was published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, and I thought I would include it today to give you an idea why focusing on empathy is so important. People will often choose to avoid empathy if they can, or ignore it, or discount other people's suffering or experiences because it takes too much of a toll on them, or what this research refers to as a cognitive cost. And so you probably have a lot of theories behind that. My personal opinion is it's probably as the result of some type of polarization in social media. Maybe more of technology is becoming more the forefront, and people aren't talking to people directly as they used to. Face-to-face interactions are not as common as they used to be in business. A lot of it's over the phone or an email or text or IMs. So there's a lot of things that kind of lead to that. But in general, people, if given the choice, will often choose not to have empathy. And that's really concerning. It's something that we really need to be working toward, not against. So here's 5 ways that empathy can have an impact on workers' compensation claims handling. How is empathy changing the workers' compensation claims experience? Well, for one, building rapport is very important. Since each claim is as different as the individual at stake, the path to a positive outcome must be personalized to meet each injured worker's needs. Approaching each person with empathy and compassion will help the claims professional build a better rapport with the injured employee so they can better understand their needs and work together toward a better outcome. The second one is customer buy-in. Once the injured worker feels they're being heard and supported, they're more likely to become engaged in the claim process. They will be more likely to respond to phone calls, submit documentation on time, and work with providers and other experts as the claim progresses. And then there's effective investigation, and this is really important for claims examiners. By using active listening skills and communicating with empathy, claims professionals are better able to gather useful information and facts during their initial interviews and their claims investigations. The injured worker feels more open to sharing information about their story and their individual needs. Claims professionals can better identify potential obstacles to recovery and provide needed resources more quickly and effectively, all because you took the time to try to understand what that person is experiencing. And when you've developed that rapport, they're more likely to share personal information with you that on the surface may not be related to the claim, but it will definitely give you information about what are some barriers to their recovery that you may not have been privy to. We see that a lot of time. That's a lot with the type of work that I do and my team does. We get at a lot of those psychosocial barriers using empathy as a technique to uncover that when we're talking to injured workers. Another benefit is better claims, better recovery outcomes. Now, when the injured worker is engaged in the claim process, they're more open to recovery services such as physical therapy or alternative pain management. If the injured worker feels more engaged in their own recovery, there are typically reductions in missed doctor's visits and treatment sessions. And so they're more likely to keep their appointment. They're also more motivated to return to work if they feel that they're being understood and someone actually gets what they're going through. They don't have as big of a chip on their shoulder about being injured at work, and some of that anger about their workplace seems to go away if they're talking to someone that they feel is caring and present. And then lastly, acceptance of a claim decision. And this is something I've seen through experience. A claim approval or denial or treatment approval or denial isn't always easy for an injured worker to accept. And when you show compassion, it doesn't mean that the claims professional will always provide the resolution the injured worker is hoping for. The claims professional's job is to educate the injured worker about the claims handling process, help explain the decision, and help them to feel understood. Now, for a variety of reasons, they may not be ready to hear that decision. Alternatively, a claim denial may be upsetting or spark anger. Experience shows that workers who are treated with empathy throughout the claims process are typically more understanding of the final claims decision and less likely to seek costly litigation. And I've seen that time and time again with our claims. This is, what does empathy look like? Now, although I work in the workers' comp realm, I'm still a licensed clinical social worker, as I mentioned before. And what I'd like to bring up are some practical steps to getting to and expressing empathy. Now, before we can do that, though, we need to know what empathy looks like. Now, here's an exercise to try. Let's take a moment, and I want you to visualize what empathy has looked like or even sounded like to you in the past. Now, visualize someone important in your life that gives off warm and nurturing vibes. And you'll probably pretty quickly think of somebody. People are naturally drawn to this person. People turn to them for help with their problems. They're a listening ear, a non-judgmental demeanor. You feel safe and heard and seen by this person. Okay. Now, the person that you are likely visualizing probably has strong empathy gifts and skills. They just seem to understand what you're going through. Now, I'd like you to think back on an experience you had calling a customer service center to sign up for cable, question a charge, return an order, get information, or had a problem that needed to get resolved. Now, how many of us can point to a good customer service experience? Now, you might need to think a little harder about this one, hopefully not too hard. But when you have an example in your mind, I want you to think about what made that a good experience for you. What was that like? Did they seem to validate your concerns? Did they appreciate the urgency you felt in getting the matter resolved? Were you upset when you started the call, and did you end the call not upset? Did they acknowledge that you were upset? If any of those are true, then that's empathy. That customer service displayed empathy. And that's what we're talking about. And this is, what does empathy not look like? Now, what I'd like to do is use that visualization again, and I want you to spend a moment and visualize not a person per se, but a time when you interacted with, again, a customer service rep, and it was not a good experience. This could even be in a retail environment where you're at a store. It could be at a doctor's office where you're interacting with office staff or even the doctor, him or herself. It could be any type of interaction that you had with some type of professional, and it was not a good experience. Now, I won't spend too much time on this slide because I think we can all think of bad examples, unfortunately. But that's what empathy does not look like typically. If you came away feeling worse than when you called or started your interaction, chances are that other person was not validating your concern and not really understanding what you were going through. And this is barriers to empathy. Well, here's some barriers that I want to make sure that we're all aware of. And most of these will affect most of us, but not all of them. But these are just some common barriers to empathy. And there are a lot of them. There's a lot more that aren't even on this list. But kind of quickly, physical or emotional fatigue. If you're feeling tired, you're feeling drained, you're not going to really have a lot of leftover energy to focus on someone else's experiences. There is the issue of burnout, which is a little different than emotional and physical fatigue. And I'll get into a little bit burnout in just a bit. The burnout I'm talking about here is empathy burnout, not just job burnout, but this is empathy burnout and what that might look like. A big barrier, though, is judgments or bias. We see this a lot, especially with people's responses to the pandemic right now. We may have our own strong opinions about that, and we have to kind of keep those in check because not everyone is reacting the same way we are. It's a test, and a lot of people are taking the test in a different way than maybe our value system encourages us to do. Maybe people are in our own families are having differences of opinion when it comes to that, or politics, or other life choices, or finances. It could just be anything. What we also see is that because we're working with injured workers a lot, that they come from all walks of life, and there may be some things in their personal lives that don't fit well with us for whatever reason, or maybe they've had other types of experiences that we may not have had that we just don't understand. And so because we may be ignorant about that or don't have a lot of experience about those situations, we may be quick to judge, and we may have a bias against that. Well, it's important that you keep that in mind because all of us have those. Nobody's immune to judgments or bias. Nobody is. Some people are better at recognizing that and overcoming them, but not everyone is as skilled at that as others. So it's just important to keep that in mind, that if you have a situation where you're going to be making a call to someone who's been injured and you've read their file and something in their file indicates to you, wow, this guy kind of deserved this, or I can't believe she did that. What was she thinking? You need to check yourself. You need to check yourself and your bias before you pick up the phone, because that will come through. You need to set that aside and really, really focus on empathy and what that other person might be experiencing. Now, other barriers to empathy include lack of skill. Not all of us have the skills to do that. Remember, we come out of childhood with some basic skills of it, but certainly not proficiencies. Proficiencies come later in life as we learn to interact with others and learn to expose ourselves to differences and different environments and different communications with people that have lived different lives than us. not all of us have gone through that. And so as a result, we have not developed the skills for empathy as we should. And that's something that we can brush up on. There may also be a lack of focus. Now, the focus could be because of emotional or physical fatigue, could be because of burnout. It could just be that you've got something going on in the back of your work office and, barking dog, or in my case, maybe there's going to be a siren going by my window that I don't have control over, but it may switch my focus for a bit. Or there might be some IT issues that, affect your focus. Try to keep those in check, acknowledge them if you can, and then move past them. Same goes with lack of concentration, lack of focus, lack of concentration. They're often used interchangeably. Both can be affected, and both can certainly impact your ability to be empathic. And then poor listening. We're going to cover listening in just a bit, and the technology barriers. Now, when I talk about technological barriers, they're definitely something to take into account. Most of our interactions with claimants and clients and employees is through email, IM, or text nowadays, especially as many of us move out of offices and work from home. Due to technology, I can place a call to a claimant using my personal cell phone, which is somehow routed through my work server, and then shows up on their caller ID as coming from my company. It's great, except that because it's from my cell phone, I'm now reliant on the mobile service provider to have a good connection. I'm also reliant on the claimant's mobile service provider to have a good connection. And I'm also reliant on all the other pieces between me and them that have to have a good connection and enough data to make for a seamless connection. Good luck with that. It's not always successful. So what do? Well, I acknowledge the limitations. Sometimes there's a little lag in the conversation because of technology. And I'll just acknowledge that, and I'll apologize for that. And I'll usually share that experience with the other person in kind of a slightly humorous way, or more of a let's roll our eyes and just get through this sort of way. It does provide a little bit of a bond for us sometimes. And then I concentrate that much more harder on not missing a beat or a word in their conversation. It's a challenge, it's a barrier, but it is something that you can overcome with enough patience and enough focus. I mentioned empathy burnout, and I'll just give you a little background on that. Empathy burnout is actually really common among those who work in the mental health field specifically. But you also see this a lot in other clinical fields, like nursing and medical and anyone that's engaging directly with people in a crisis situation, where you're doing a lot of rapport building in a very short period of time with a lot of different people. Burnout sets in, and it's sometimes called compassion fatigue. A lot of the history of compassion fatigue is related to post-traumatic stress disorder and how you will see that among helpers. And it used to be called secondary stress disorder, and now they call it just compassion fatigue. And it's just a real thing that a lot of people in this field experience, and a lot of people in claims handling fields also experience, because you're dealing with a lot of people that are going through really, really difficult times in their lives. Now, employee burnout in general is also a barrier to empathy. And as a side note, I'm seeing this a lot lately during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially burnout among employees and even some colleagues who are feeling tapped out. I refer a lot to the issue of bandwidth, and we all have our limits, our bandwidth. Once it's reached, doing anything extra, like focusing on the needs of the person suffering, becomes really difficult. And if you're finding that your employees are suffering from burnout, I encourage you to learn more about ways to address that in the workplace and move through it. And I'll just give you a starting tip, though. It begins with empathy on your part. You've probably heard the value of open-ended versus closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions are useful in gathering information. For example, what was that like? You can also try open-ended statements like, tell me more about that. Closed-ended questions get to the facts, yes, no, and single-word responses. So in an investigation, you're going to use a combination of both closed and open-ended questions and statements. The purpose of using open-ended questions, though, and open-ended statements is to get the other person talking, really, with you, and also to provide you with more information. Yes, you want to get a better understanding of what the issues are. That's important. But what's more important is just getting the other person comfortable in talking with you. And that takes some practice. Other things you can try are paraphrasing what they just said, and that will help the other person feel that you're listening. It's a good exercise to use that will actually force you to listen more carefully to what they're saying if you know that you're going to be paraphrasing it at the end. You can also, you can't convey empathy without first listening to the other person. And lastly, they really should be doing more talking than you. That's sort of the golden rule of rapport building as well as empathy. They should be doing more of the talking. Now, over the phone, no one can see you nod or smile, but your demeanor can often be heard. When you pick up the phone, put a smile on your face when talking. That actually will lift your vocal cords in a way, relax your mouth, and sound softer and more soothing to a person. And that's wonderful for them to feel that you care about them. It's just a trick. You can also make sure that they know that you are listening by making just some brief comments that encourage the flow of the conversation. Or I see, or tell me more. It's important to listen to what is said, but it's even more important to listen to what is not said. Respect the silence and let them talk. Now, let me give you an example of what I can learn by talking with someone and listening more than I'm talking. And I'm just really listening intently on these conversations. I listen for background noise. I listen for babies crying, arguments, car driving, TV station, ice clinking in a glass, cigarettes being lit, other people in the room, outdoor sounds. I'm also listening for when people don't directly answer a question or they hem and haw before answering. Why is that? What don't they want to tell me? And remember, listening is not for the weak. It takes a lot of work, concentration, and patience. But if you're really also listening for the unspoken word, you can gather a lot of information about what they're avoiding. And that will give you a better understanding of what they're going through, so you can convey empathy to them. And I think we have Act with Empathy on the main screen right now. And this is, again, one of my favorite terms because it highlights the action. Empathy is not a passive thing. It's a very active thing, and you have to work at it. And you also have to show it in almost all of your interactions with injured workers in order to keep them engaged. Now, here are a few ways that we can act with empathy. First is conveying empathy with someone. It goes back to the communication and the empathic statements that we talked about before. Reflecting on what their experiences are, validating their feelings, expressing and demonstrating you understand their situation. So you actually need to say that. Like, I get what you're saying. I use that phrase a lot. I get what you're saying. Or, wow, that makes sense. I use that a lot too. And those are very powerful statements for someone who's telling you something and they're feeling vulnerable. Now, authenticity is also key. We want to come across as genuine when we act with empathy. This is where it's important to acknowledge if you do, in fact, understand what they're going through. If you don't, be authentic about it and say, I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. If you truly can't imagine something that difficult, it's okay to acknowledge that. And that brings us to the issue of selective self-disclosure. And this is just more of a tip that we use a lot in social work and mental health. And it's something that I encourage you to try if you are not already doing this, but be very selective about your self-disclosure. And what I mean by that is, you probably heard the phrase, you need to give something in order to get something. And in this case, that giving something is self-disclosure. So you're revealing a piece of yourself personally to someone else as a way to connect with them and make them feel more comfortable in then sharing personal information with you. There has to be a balancing act somewhat in order to get some people to talk more. So I'll usually pull up something that I have heard in the background. I may mention, oh, I hear a dog barking. Yeah, I have a dog too. What kind of dog do you have? So I've revealed something about myself, not a lot of personal information, but I've revealed something about myself that gives a connection to the other person. My colleague will often talk about her kids. Not a lot, but she will acknowledge if they have kids, especially around the same age. She may share some struggles she's having with home learning, for example, especially during the pandemic. And so that's just another way to use some information about yourself to make a connection with somebody else. It's very effective. And what if you're just not feeling it? That's a big barrier. Is it okay to fake it till you make it? Well, maybe. Although be careful because not everybody can fake it convincingly. But yes, it's possible to fake empathy if you are truly not feeling it in that moment. Try to keep it at a minimum and try not to be too enthusiastic about it. But yes, it is possible to fake it till you make it. What I find more interesting, though, is if I am at a point where I'm hitting a wall when it comes to empathy, I know for me it's time to take a quick mental break. I'll work on something else that doesn't involve speaking with someone else, perhaps reviewing a report or catching up on documentation, maybe answering an email. And sometimes when I find that that little break I took will then recharge me, and then I can then muster empathy for the next call. Sometimes in the middle of a call, I'm triggered because of something they said or something that maybe I have a judgment about or a bias about. At those times, you don't want to end the call, but I'll take a deep breath sometimes, hit myself mute, take a breath, and then I tap into my imagination with a simple question. I wonder what it's like to go through what they're going through. Have I had a similar situation before? What was that like? Do I know anyone personally who's experienced this? Most of the time, that's all I need to refresh empathy. And we're coming up on the end, and I just want to go over just sort of an overview. And this is part of the conclusion section too, but just in general, these are the basics of empathy I'd like you to take away with. And we're going to have some time for a few questions. We have the acting with empathy. We've got some overcoming barriers. But I just want to remind you that a lot of empathy is going to involve imagination and focus and communication. Remember, empathy usually starts with imagination. You need to actually imagine yourself in someone else's situation. Think back to the childhood development stuff we talked about. This is pretend play. Use your imagination, especially if you're running into some barriers. And then we need to focus. We need to focus on actually what we're going to say and focus on what they're feeling and literally put ourselves in their shoes. And then we need to communicate with empathy. And that includes both active listening, which we talked about, and speaking. And remember, it's better to let the other person speak more than you do, but you still need to use your right words to convey empathy. So be very mindful of that as well. So I want to open it up right now. Chase, you can go to not the next one, but the slide after that. This says thank you. And I'm going to quickly open my screen, and that's not working. Well, I hope you can still hear me. Chase, are we able to go through some questions? Anything come up?
Sure. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and ask you some questions that came in, but the first one is more of a statement, and from their experience from the industry or from with the injured workers. So it says, from my experience, injured workers are not keen to share all the relevant information simply because they know that once the system knows that that there is other personal information, the system will shift its focus from supportive to non-supportive, especially when their non-workers' compensation information is used to limit the required medical and allied health services that are requiring. So I guess that's just more of a statement on in the beginning of your presentation. So maybe when it's trying to get them to share information, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think a lot what can make them feel more comfortable throughout the process is if you really focused on rapport building, even during your very first contacts with them, and create a safe enough environment for them to share information with you. We all know some examiners who run into this problem more than others. And I think really the ones that are successful at this are really, really skilled at empathy. And it's important to get some useful information. Honestly, I view any personal information as possibly useful in a claims handling environment, although there are some things that I don't particularly share with examiners if it seems like someone is telling me really personal stuff that's very sensitive that has nothing to do with the claim handling. For example, childhood abuse issues or domestic violence and their history, unless it relates to some type of injury now. So you kind of have to use a judgment call, and it may be helpful to talk with a supervisor to determine what information can be used or shared and what should remain private. I know that kind of talked. I know it wasn't an actual question, but that's sort of how I'm seeing it. Kristen, did that come through? Okay.
Yeah. So again, audience, if you have questions for Mark, now is the time to ask them. Also, his contact information is at the screen. So how to do that is in your GoToWebinar panel, go ahead and hit the questions and type them in there, and I'll read it to him. So the next question is, how do you think language barriers impact the ability to communicate empathy? Do you think the use of translation services is a barrier?
Absolutely. In fact, when we're talking about technology, translation services would fall right into that. Translation services, those of us who've used them, and I use them sometimes more often than I'd like, because I'm just not fluent in other languages, but there is going to be a language barrier. What you want to do is, if you're using a translation line, make sure before they place the call to the injured worker that you give them sort of the lay of the land first, so they understand you're calling about a workers' comp injury, but keep your questions really narrow if you can. Like if you're just checking in to see how someone's feeling, let the translator know that in advance and just have a brief conversation with them before they place the call. That way they have an idea of sort of the parameters that you're going to be looking at. And then, frankly, your calls are going to be a lot shorter in content, although probably a lot longer in time because of the translation. But you're really going to be focusing on a few key pieces of information. And also you want to convey that you are understanding what you're going through and understand that this is a difficult situation. I've been fairly successful at getting empathy across, even using a translator. And it's because, when you're doing, if it's something like Spanish where I have a familiarity to it, if it's someone who's speaking Spanish, I know a couple key phrases like lo siento or perdóname or something you just say that just indicates that, yeah, I get what they're saying. I'm not fluent, but I can at least understand. And then I'm also really listening to the tone of their voice. You can hear a lot by tone of voice, even if you don't understand all the words. And so I listen to the tone of voice. I'm also listening to the translator's words, and then I'm matching those two up. And if they don't seem consistent, then I'm asking about that. So, but yeah, it is a barrier. Absolutely.
Okay. Next question is, if we focus on empathy with dealing with an injured worker, do we run the risk of inadvertently introducing a psychiatric condition to the claim?
Oh, good question. No, you don't. What you do run the risk of is getting a lot more information maybe that you asked for. But more information, in my opinion, is a good thing. The more you know about it, the better off you're going to be, especially when you're investigating a claim, and you can follow up on certain things later. I've used the empathy approach for 6 years now on workers' comp claim, and I can tell you it's never resulted in a psych accepted file. Now, there are psych-accepted files that I am working on, and those I make very clear that I understand that they're already accepted for psych. And that's a very different conversation because usually you're trying to help someone access the type of appropriate psychiatric treatment to address their trauma, usually. But for those who have an injured shoulder or a back injury, and psych is not accepted on the file, they don't turn into psych-accepted files simply because you're asking how they're feeling and you acknowledge this is a challenging time for them because of finances or because of their family dynamics or because of other stressors that may be going on in their lives. So it's a good question. It's not something that it's not something that happens though, in my experience.
Perfect. Are there concerns that the examiners may hear more about an individual's personal history than they can handle? Using your examples of past abuse, what should they do?
You can always go from passive questions to active questions and ask more closed-ended questions if you find yourself becoming more overwhelmed. I would encourage you to write it out a bit if you can, because you are going to get a lot more information if you are more focused on open-ended questions and open-ended statements. You do sometimes run the risk that people will share a lot more information with you than you thought was going to come to you. I would say write it out, enjoy it, develop that rapport with them, let them know you understand them, and then build upon that relationship with them for your next conversation with them. Now, sometimes people are lonely and you may get sucked into an hour-long phone call and you just don't have that kind of time if you have a huge caseload. There's polite ways that you can end the call or set up frameworks at the beginning of a call if that becomes a problem. Like, hey, I have 20 minutes to talk to you, or I have 10 minutes to talk to you right now to check in. I'm just checking to see how you're feeling, and really focus your statements that way. But yeah, you sometimes open the door, but it's not a bad door to open.
How do I get my adjusters to show more empathy when they speak to claimants?
That's the $100 question. Keep in mind, it is a skill that you can learn, and you can encourage them to do some continuing education on it. Maybe focusing on customer service and interviewing skills. I would probably frame it in terms of active listening skills or customer service skills again. There might be some things that your company does. At Cedric, we have a Cedric University that has a bunch of training modules that people can tap into to learn some of these skills. I've done a lot of trainings among staff at our company. Perhaps your company has something like that as well. But it is definitely a skill that can be learned. It does become a performance issue, though, and that may be a whole different discussion that you would have with them. Check with your human resources department to see if they have additional resources that you can tap into for that. But just keep in mind that not everybody has the same skill set. And sometimes if they're coming in from another company that hadn't really focused on empathy, but your company does, that may be something new that they need to learn. And they need to be taught that. And it is something that people can be taught.
Awesome. What if there just isn't time to have empathy with a huge caseload?
Yeah, that's probably the bigger challenge. I think a lot of examiners I hear say, there's always time. There's always time. Think of the amount of time that you're going to save if you can get a person on the phone and spend a few extra minutes with them to get some additional information. And then they are more likely to return your calls, and they're more likely to respond to your emails for requests for information, and they're more likely to not miss appointments. Think how much time you're saving down the line by developing that rapport with them with empathy at the beginning. So even though it may seem like an extra couple minutes to you now and I just don't have that time, it's actually going to save you a ton of time later on in the claims process. And you're going to have a lot more engagement on their part because they feel a connection to you. And that's a good thing. And that's going to help you with your job.
Okay, so another question. Defendants tend to misunderstand and want to use everything against injured workers. How do you teach adjusters to develop trust?
Develop trust with an injured worker. Trust can be established in a lot of different ways. I think it's important to be authentic with somebody. It's important to be polite with them. It's important to set up expectations that are reasonable and follow through with them. And it does not hurt to explain the process to people and have a sense of transparency. All of that goes a long way toward trust. Think of it from the injured worker's perspective. They're calling an 800 number or wherever. They're reporting their claim, and they're probably going through a phone tree, and it may be a while before they can talk to a live person, and maybe someone has to call them back. And so already they're not liking working with you. You know that going into that, they probably already have some negative thoughts about what you're going to do with them. And they may also have some of their own feelings, negative feelings about their employer because they were injured on the job and don't feel like things were always done safely or whatever reason. There may be a whole bunch of reasons that people have different feelings about their job. And you calling in to them to talk about their personal issues may feel really intrusive. So the way to develop trust is to explain, and then be patient, and then ask them about what's going on with them, and really focusing again on empathy and getting to an understanding of what their emotional state is for this. I can hear that you're frustrated with this process. I'm sorry about that. And I think that will go a long way to getting them to trust you. But yeah, building trust, the whole big training, I've done those before, but those are some key components of that I think would be worth remembering.
And last question, is it possible to convey too much empathy with injured workers?
I love that question. Yeah, it's possible. I've rarely seen it happen. Usually we run into the opposite, where you're not conveying enough. But it is possible to convey too much empathy. Keep in mind that at the end of the day, the call and your interaction with the caller or the claimant should be more about them than you. And you really want to get a good understanding about what their emotional state is and what their experiences are right now. You need to also be aware of what your role is. And your role is not their therapist. You're not going to be doing counseling on the phone. You're not going to be doing motivational interviewing on the phone. I may do that, but most people aren't in the type of work that I do. You're going to be focusing on trying to help them with their claims process. So kind of figure out what feels comfortable for you in advance, and what limits are comfortable for you. But also look at the big picture in that showing empathy is going to get you a lot of things too that are going to be beneficial for your claims handling. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. It's going to take some practice. Sometimes people go a little overboard when they're first starting, and that's okay. It may help to have someone listen in on a few of your calls while you're learning this new skill. But it can be learned. I'll tell you though, most people are not going to experience that. Most people are going to err the other side. So it's just not something that happens all that often.
All right. Well, we ended right on time. So thank you so much. Round of applause. Thank you, Mark. If we were in a room, the audience would be clapping. So we're all clapping.
Yeah. And I apologize again for some of the technical issues. I don't know if you can even see me, but I can visually see you in my mind. So we'll go with that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say this is an excellent tie into our next session. So Mark, thank you so much. This was a great session. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah, I think so too. And there's Mark's contact information, audience, so that if you do want to reach out to Mark, you can, and have any questions. Again, a lot that the comments have been, thank you so much. Great topic. Some of the audience has sent in, as well as ways to implement not only professionally, but personally. And like I said, I can do the same. So thank you so much. And yeah, thank you. And so if you want to go ahead and we'll get going on to the quick break. So everybody don't leave. But thank you, Mark. Anything else, Yvonne, before we go?
No, thanks, Mark. I really love the topic, and it was very interesting and engaging. Appreciate you.
My pleasure, and thanks for your support in this.